The day the news broke, the music world stopped breathing. Ace Frehley, the sound, the face, the legend, was finally laid to rest. No guitars, no roaring crowds, no stage lights, just silence. A silence so heavy it felt unnatural for a man whose entire life was built on noise. But inside that still dimly lit chapel, one moment shattered the quiet. The moment his daughter, Monique Frehley, rose to speak. What began as a funeral turned into something far more powerful. Her tribute didn't just honor him, it rewrote how people understood him. In a room full of decades of history, fame, mistakes, and memories, it was Monique's voice that rose above all of it, and left the world stunned. Ace Frehley was more than a guitarist, he was a cultural blueprint. His sound shaped generations, his image became iconic, and his presence was larger than any headline about band feuds or personal chaos. He was one of those rare figures people subconsciously believed would never disappear, too loud, too legendary, too woven into the DNA of rock to ever go silent. And yet, there they were, friends, family, and former collaborators sitting in pews, facing the reality that even the loudest legends eventually closed their curtain. It wasn't just a funeral, it was a historical goodbye, the closing of a chapter music never thought it would have to turn. The bond between Ace Frehley and his daughter Monique was never the polished, picture-perfect kind that people like to imagine when they talk about legends and their families. It was a real, human relationship built on love, damaged by distance, and repaired not by grand gestures but by time and effort. There were years when Ace's career swallowed him whole. Years when fame and personal battles pulled him away from the people who loved him most. Monique grew up not just with a father, but with a legend, and that meant living with absences, rumors, expectations, and a last name that came with shadows and applause in equal measure. Yet with all the gaps, they never severed. There were phone calls after silence, quiet visits after long breaks, and unspoken forgiveness in moments when words failed. Ace was not a perfect father, but he was hers. The man who tried, stumbled, returned, and in his own way loved deeply. In his later years, the noise of the world slowed down. And so did he, and that gave space for something rare. Reconciliation without needing to rewrite the past. Their relationship was not clean, but it was honest, stitched together by pride, pain, history, and the simple truth that love can exist even inside imperfection. The chapel was small, dim, and reverent, the kind of room where even breathing felt like an intrusion. The air carried the faint scent of polished wood and wilted flowers, a mix of beauty and decay that matched the occasion. Rows of black suits filled the pews, former bandmates, producers, lifelong friends, and faces that once shared backstage chaos, now united in stillness. Men who once tuned guitars before sold-out shows now sat with clasped hands and lowered eyes, as if even their memories had gone quiet for the day. There were no amplifiers, no smoke machines, no screaming fans, just the dull echo of footsteps and the occasional choked breath trying not to escape. The same hands that once applauded Ace's solos now trembled with handkerchiefs. On one side, an old tour manager wiped his glasses. On another, a drummer who had spent half his life on stage with Ace stared at the floor, unable to look at the casket. The silence itself felt like an audience holding its breath. At the front of the room rested the casket, deep mahogany, closed, final. Beside it stood a large black and white portrait of Ace in his prime. Hair wild, face painted, guitar raised mid, frozen forever in the version of him the world will never forget. The contrast between that image and the quiet wooden box beneath it made the reality hit like a blow. The man who once drowned out arenas with sound was now the reason for a silence so thick it pressed against the chest. There was no applause, no encore, no noise, only the weight of a life that thundered for decades and ended in a stillness too heavy for words. And before anyone found the strength to speak, everyone in that chapel shared the same unspoken realization. Legends don't die quietly, but this is how they are buried. When Monique stood, the room changed. She didn't walk to the podium like someone used to microphones or attention. She walked like a daughter who had just lost the only father she would ever have. Her steps were slow, shoulders drawn inward, almost as if she had to lift the weight of their entire shared history with every footstep. The moment she reached the microphone, the silence deepened. Even people who had seen her since childhood sat up straighter, knowing this was not a prepared speech. This was a wound speaking aloud. Her hands trembled as she unfolded a paper she barely glanced at. Her voice broke before her words even formed, not the break of performance, but the break of a person holding back years of love and regret at the same time. She didn't start with his career or his fame. She didn't recite accolades or chart positions. She started with something simple. I grew up waiting for him, and still, I loved him through all of it. The line landed like a confession and a release. She spoke in fragments, memory layered over memory. Childhood birthdays spent watching tour buses leave. Nights listening to his music before bed just to feel like he was in the same world as her. The years of silence. Then the phone call that reopened everything. She spoke about the pride she felt when strangers told her how her father changed their lives. And the ache she felt, knowing he couldn't always show up in hers. At one point, she paused, eyes closed, breath shaking, and whispered, "He was flawed. And he was mine." No polish. No perfect phrasing, just truth stripped of ego, a truth only a daughter can speak. Loving a legend means sharing him with the world while losing him in ways no one else sees. Her tribute wasn't beautiful because it was eloquent, it was beautiful because it was real. She didn't bury a rock icon that day, she buried her father. And for the first time in that room full of people who knew him as a myth, they were forced to see him as a man. Monique didn't use her time at the podium to rewrite history or pretend the past was gentle. Instead, she did what most children of complicated parents never get the chance. She spoke the truth with love. She talked about the ache of waiting for a father who belonged to everyone but her. She admitted the anger she once carried. The confusion of being proud of a man the world idolized while hurting from the parts of him the world never saw. Then her voice softened. She spoke about the late-night calls in recent years, about second chances that came not with apologies but with effort. She shared how he tried clumsily, imperfectly, to be present before time ran out. And she said she forgave him, not because he fixed everything, but because he tried before the clock stopped ticking. "I didn't need a perfect father," she said through shaking breath. "I needed a present one, and in the end, he came back to me." She thanked him for what he did give, the music that became part of her bloodstream, the laughter he brought when he let the performer fall away, and the quiet moments when he looked at her, not like a fan, but like a daughter. The line that broke the room was the one she delivered with tears still spilling down her cheeks. Asterisk, the world lost a legend today, but I lost the man who finally chose to love me before he left. In that one sentence, grief, forgiveness, and closure collapsed into a single truth. The chapel didn't just hear a tribute, it felt a daughter lay down the last of her anger and replace it with peace. When the applause of a career fades, what remains is the imprint a life leaves on human beings, not playlists or posters, but people. Ace Frehley's legacy cannot be contained in vinyl sleeves or Hall of Fame plaques. His true legacy lived in the way he pushed boundaries, inspired millions to pick up guitars, and carved a permanent scar into the culture of music. But there was another legacy, quieter, more fragile, that existed away from the lights. The legacy of a flawed man who, in the end, faced himself honestly enough to earn forgiveness from the ones who mattered most. For the world, Ace was an icon, a force that electrified arenas and rewrote what rock could look and sound like. But for those who sat in that chapel, his legacy was also in the lessons his imperfections taught, that talent and humanity can coexist, that redemption is possible late in life, and that even legends must bow to mortality, humility, and love. The music world will remember Ace for his sound, but Monique reminded them that the man behind that sound, broken, brilliant, stubborn, vulnerable, mattered just as much. His loudest contribution may have been his art, but his most meaningful one was this final act of human honesty, allowing his life to end, not as a myth, but as a man who was forgiven. In the end, it wasn't the legend that was honored, it was the humanity that survived beneath it. When Monique stepped down from the podium, the chapel did not move. It was as if everyone needed a moment to absorb what they had just witnessed, the transformation of a funeral into a confession of love and closure. Then, slowly, the service moved toward its final act. The casket was rolled forward, and the choir began a soft, stripped-down hymn. No guitars, no drums, just human voices filling the space where Ace once filled the world with sound. Men who once headbanged beside him now bowed their heads like altar boys. Shoulders shook quietly in the pews. Even those who never knew him personally felt the weight of finality settle on their skin. Before the lid was taken from view, Monique walked forward one last time. She didn't speak, there were no words left that hadn't already been bled out. She simply placed her hand on the polished wood and held it there, eyes closed, as if sealing every unfinished sentence, every forgiven memory, every inherited ache inside that moment. Then she whispered just loud enough that the first few rows could hear, "Rest now, Dad." That was the real ending. Not the prayer, not the recessional, not the closing of doors. It was a daughter releasing her father from both fame and debt. When she stepped back and the casket disappeared from sight, It wasn't just a body being carried away, it was an era, a soundtrack, a storm of a life taking its final bow. The man the world met as a legend left the room as something much smaller and much greater. A human being finally allowed to be at peace. In the end, Ace Frehley's funeral was not a spectacle, it was a revelation. For decades, the world only knew the version of him built on noise, makeup, and myth. But in that chapel, stripped of lights and applause, he was finally seen as what he truly was. A man who loved imperfectly, hurt deeply, tried late, and left behind people who chose to remember him with grace instead of resentment. Monique's tribute did more than honor him, it humanized him. She did what the world never could. She spoke to the father, not the legend. And in doing so, she reminded everyone listening that the most powerful legacy isn't what millions celebrate. It's what the few closest to you choose to forgive. Ace's music will outlive him, that is certain, but the forgiveness spoken over him in that room may be the part of his story that matters most. Because fame makes you unforgettable, but forgiveness makes you free.